Chapter 7, Boundaries and Your Spouse. If there were ever a relationship where boundaries could get confused, it is marriage, where by design husband and wife become one flesh. Ephesians 5, verse 31. Boundaries foster separateness. Marriage has as one of its goals the giving up of some of our separateness and becoming one. What a potential state of confusion. And in fact, more marriages fail because of poor boundaries than any other reason. This chapter applies the law of boundaries as well as the boundary myth to the marital relationship. Is this yours, mine, or ours? A marriage mirrors the relationship that Christ has with his bride, the church. Ephesians 5, verse 22 to 33. Christ has some things that only he can do. The church has some things that only it can do. And they have some things they do together. Page 153. Similarly, in marriage, some duties one spouse does, some the other does, and some they do together. Page 153. What are some duties you do? What are some duties your spouse does? And what are some duties you do together? How well is this division of labor working for you and your spouse? When two people marry, each participates in the relationship, doing duties that correspond to individual abilities and interests, and each has his or her own life. Where boundaries get confused is in the elements of personhood. The elements of the soul that each person possesses can choose to share with someone else. The problem arises when one trespasses on the other's personhood and tries to control the feelings, attitudes, behaviors, choices, and values of the other. Page 153 to 54. Feelings. One of the most important elements that promotes intimacy between two people is the ability of each to take responsibility for his or her own feelings. We do not communicate our feelings by saying, I feel that you. We communicate our feelings by saying, I feel sad or hurt or lonely or scared. Such vulnerability is the beginning of intimacy and caring. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 13, page 154 to 55. What feelings are you able to express in your marriage? What feelings would you like to be able to express? What do you tend to do rather than express your feelings to your spouse? How does the behavior you just described affect your relationship with your spouse? What feelings do you need to take responsibility for today and share with your spouse? Desires. Like feelings, desires are another element of personhood that each spouse needs to clarify and take responsibility for. Problems arise when we make someone else responsible for our needs and wants and blame them for our disappointments. James 4, verse 26. Marriage is about getting conflicting wants worked out. Page 155 to 56. Taking responsibility for getting your wants fulfilled is a rule of life. Review Susan and Jim's situation. What situation in your marriage, if any, does it remind you of? What conflicting wants do you and your spouse need to work out? Limits on what I can give. We are finite creatures and must give as we decide in our heart to give. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7. Being aware of when we have given past the love point to the resentment point. Problems arise when we blame our spouse for our own lack of limits. Your spouse is not responsible for your limits, you are. Only you know what you can and want to give, and only you can be responsible for drawing that line. If you do not draw it, you can quickly become resentful. Page 156 to 57. Often spouses will do more than they really want to and then resent the other for not stopping them from overgiving. Review Bob and Nancy's situation. What situation in your marriage, if any, does it remind you of? Where do you need to set limits on what you will give your spouse? Where do you need to take responsibility for your own wants instead of expecting your spouse to take care of them all for you? Applying the laws of boundaries to marriage. In chapter 5 of the text, we talked about the 10 laws of boundaries. Let's apply 5 of them to troubled marital situations. Page 158. The law of sowing and reaping. Many times, one spouse may be out of control, but may not suffer the consequences of this behavior. Letting your spouse suffer the consequences of being allowed to suffer the consequences for your own behavior is not manipulation. Instead, someone is limiting how they will allow themselves to be treated and exhibiting self control. The natural consequences are falling on the shoulder of the responsible party. Galatians 6, verse 7. Page 158 to 59. For which of your actions is your spouse not letting you suffer the consequences? For which actions do you need to let your spouse suffer the consequences? What is keeping you from letting your spouse suffer the consequences for his or her behavior? The law of responsibility. People who set limits exhibit self control and show responsibility for themselves. Setting limits is an act of love. By binding and limiting the evil, they protect the good. Instead of taking responsibility for people we love, we rescue them or rescuing them. We need to show responsibility to them by confronting evil when we see it. Keep in mind that the most responsible behavior possible is usually the most difficult. Page 159. Where are you getting angry, pouting, and acting disappointed in hopes of controlling your spouse? Where are you waiting to be rescued rather than taking responsibility for yourself? Where are you giving in to your spouse's anger, pouting, and disappointments, and thereby taking responsibility for what he or she is feeling? Where are you rescuing your spouse? See Proverbs 19, verse 19. Explain the difference between being responsible to your spouse and being responsible for him or her. Where do you need to show responsibility in your marriage today? What evil do you see and need to confront? The law of power. We have acknowledged our basic inability to change other people. A better path than complaining or pestering, therefore, is accepting people as they are, respecting their choice to be that way, and then letting them experience appropriate consequences. You only have power over yourself. Give up trying to have control and power over someone else. Galatians 5, verse 23, page 160. What issues do you find yourself pestering your spouse about? What do you think about the better path proposed above? What consequences might your spouse experience? Could these consequences promote the change that your pestering won't? Review the before boundaries and after boundaries example on page 160. How will you approach your spouse's behavior, the one you've been pestering him or her about, the next time the occasion arises? Plan the words you will say to set boundaries. What issues do you find yourself being pestered about? What does this discussion suggest about why you aren't changing? If your spouse were to establish some healthy boundaries, what consequences do you think would prompt a change? The law of evaluation. When you confront your husband or wife and begin to set boundaries, your partner may be hurt. In evaluating the pain that your boundary setting caused your spouse, remember that love and limits go together. Hebrews 12, verse 11. When you set boundaries, be loving, responsible to the person in pain. Page 160 to 61. How do you think your spouse will react when you start setting boundaries? Wise and loving spouses accept boundaries and act responsibly toward them. Spouses who are controlling and self centered will react angrily. How do you want to respond to the reaction you anticipate? You may have already begun setting boundaries. If so, how did your spouse react? And did you respond to him or her? How would you have liked to respond? Remember that a boundary always deals with you. You are not demanding that your spouse do anything. Even respect your boundaries. You are setting boundaries to say what you will do or will not do. Page 161. Keep this truth in mind as you consider your spouse's boundaries. What boundaries of his or hers do you need to respect more? And which of your boundaries will that force you to become responsible for? The law of exposure. In a marriage, more so than any other relationship, need for revealing boundaries is important. Passive boundaries such as withdrawing, triangulation, pouting, affairs, and passive aggressive behavior are extremely destructive to the relationship. Page 161. Where are you or your spouse passively and therefore destructively revealing your boundaries? Look at some of the options listed in the preceding paragraph. Boundaries need to be communicated first verbally and then with actions. You need to be clear and unapologetic. And the various boundaries we've looked at need to be respected and revealed at different times in marriage. Page 161 to 63. Skin. Physical boundary violations can range from hurtful displays of affection to physical abuse. Where are you not treating your spouse the way you want to be treated? Where is your spouse not treating you the way you want to be treated? What will you say to define the boundary you want him or her to honor? Words. What issues are you hesitating to confront your spouse about? Where do you need to say, I do not feel comfortable with that? I do not want to, or I won't. How do you want to respond when your spouse makes statements like those to you? Truth. Where are you being less than honest in your communication with your spouse? Do you need to tell your partner that he or she is violating one of God's standards? Ephesians 4, verse 25. Do you need to work on owning your feelings and hurt and in love communicating those feelings to your spouse? Physical space. Do you remove yourself from injurious situations in the marriage to protect your treasures? When you need time away, do you let your spouse know that he or she is experiencing the consequences of his or her out of control behavior? Matthew 18, verse 17. 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 13. Or do you let your partner guess? How would you want your partner to treat you if the roles were reversed? What will you say the next time you need some space? Emotional distance. If you have been hurt in a troubled marriage, waiting to trust again is wise. You need to see if your spouse is truly repentant, and you need to judge actions, not mere words. James 2, verses 14 to 26. Who is praying with you and supporting you as you wait? Time. Are you giving your spouse the time he or she needs to take care of himself or herself responsibly? Are you taking time for yourself? What do you do apart from your spouse that energizes you and gives you something to bring back to your marriage? Do you take time apart or away from problem areas? Other people. If you are learning to set boundaries in your marriage, from whom are you getting the help and support you need? If you haven't yet found a counselor or support group, when will you? What is holding you back? Con- Consequences. What consequences do you need to let your spouse experience? What consequences do you need to spell out now that you are setting better boundaries in your marriage? But that doesn't sound submissive. Whenever we talk about a wife setting boundaries, someone asks about the biblical idea of submission, page 163. What is your understanding of submission? Read Ephesians 5, verse 21. What does the verse teach us about who should be in submission to whom and why? What picture of submission do you find in verse 5, Ephesians 5, verse 24 to 27? Evaluate your marriage, ideally with your spouse, by asking the following questions. Is the husband's relationship with the wife similar to Christ's relationship with the church? How is it similar? How is it different? Does the wife have free choice or is she under the law? The feeling wrath, guilt, insecurity, and alienation, feeling that the Bible promises the law will bring Romans 4, verse 15, Galatians 5, verse 4, and James 2, verse 10. Does the husband offer the wife grace and unconditional love? Is the wife in a position of no condemnation, Romans 8, verse 1, or does her husband fail to wash her, Ephesians 5, verse 26, of all guilt? We may feel as if we are loving our spouse with grace and unconditional love, but is that what he or she is experiencing? Listen to what your spouse has to say to you. Page 164. Read Ephesians 5, verse 28 to 29. How do these verses undermine the idea of slave-like submission? Christ never takes away our will or asks us to do something hurtful. He never pushes us past our limits. He never uses us as objects. He gave himself up for us, and he takes care of us as we would his own body. Page 164. We have never seen a submission problem that did not have a controlling husband at its root. Why does this make sense? How would you expect a controlling husband to act when his wife starts setting clear boundaries and putting biblical limits on hurtful behavior? When the pattern in a marriage set boundaries, when the partners in a marriage set boundaries, the marriage can then grow and develop. Page 164. A question of balance. Many dimensions need to be balanced in a marriage relationship. Problems come when the balance is not mutual. Remember, Meredith and Paul. She was in charge of toughness, and he was in charge of separateness rather than both of them being responsible for both. Page 164 to 65. Is there mutual balance in your marriage? Is one spouse always powerful and the other powerless? Is one spouse always strong and the other weak? Like Meredith and Paul, is one spouse always wanting togetherness and the other separateness? Does one spouse always want sex while the other is never interested? When you find yourself in an unequal relationship, you may lack boundaries. Setting boundaries may correct the imbalance. For example, when Paul set boundaries on Meredith's demands, he wanted her to become more independent. Page 166. What other issues in your marriage seem out of mutual balance? Disciplining the children? Spending money? Where do you need to set boundaries? What will be your first step? Resolution. It is often easy to see problems, but difficult to make the hard choices and take the risks that result in healthy change. Page 166. Let's look at the steps required for personal change in a mutual relationship. Work through these 9 steps for every boundary conflict that arises in your marriage. Page 166 to 68. Inventory that symptom. What is the problem? Do you and your spouse agree to take action to resolve it? Identify the specific boundary problem. What boundary issues is behind the symptom you identified above? Who is having trouble saying no? Who is having trouble hearing no? Find the origins of the conflict. What did you experience and therefore learn in your family of origin that you are now transferring to your marriage? What fears, expectations, or self-doubts, for instance, are affecting how you relate to your partner? Take in the good, What support system is offering you the strength you need? Ecclesiastes 4, verse 12. As you learn to set boundaries, where can you go for help as you develop your boundaries? Practice. Who are some safe people with whom you can practice your new boundaries? When you tell one of them no, share an opinion that is different, or give something without expecting anything in return. Say no to the bad. What bad in your relationship? What abuse? What unreasonable demands do you need to put limits on? Remember the parable of the servant entrusted with gold by their master. Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. Where is no growth without risk and a facing up to fear. Forgive unforgiving people, allow other people to control them. Who are you allowing to control you because you are not forgiving them? Become proactive. Set some boundaries instead of letting your spouse be in control. What do you want to do? What will you do to reach that goal? What will your limits be in the out of control areas of your relationship? What will you no longer allow yourself to be a party to? What will you no longer tolerate? What consequences will you set? Learn to love in freedom and responsibility. The goal of boundaries and love coming out of freedom, you can freely choose to lay down your life for a friend, John 15, verse 13, and serve others as Christ himself served. Where are you still giving out of a sense of guilt and obligation? Out of a self-centered, what hopes to receive in return, or out of boundaryless compliance? To whom can you give something, be specific, simply because you want to? Do so. This kind of practice will help you learn to love freely. Setting and receiving firm boundaries with your spouse can lead to a much greater intimacy. Take the risk, knowing that the reward can be very worthwhile. Page 168. Prayer. Gracious and generous God, I thank you for the gift of marriage, this continuing process of two becoming one in you. As you work in my marriage, teach me to respect the personhood of my spouse so that ours is a godly union, not an unhealthy enmeshment that glorifies you. Teach me to be honest and to take responsibility for my feelings, desires, attitudes, behaviors, choices, values, and limits, and to be lovingly responsible to my spouse when my confronting him or her results in pain. Help me to communicate my boundaries clearly and unapologetically, and to back them up with actions. Help me to take the risk I need to take in my marriage, knowing that you will be with me. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.